Welcome to the NCFE podcast, a podcast dedicated to training, education, lifelong learning, and supporting progression into sustainable employment from leading education charity NCFE, featuring guests from across the sector.
Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us for this very special episode of the NCFE podcast in honour of Mental Health Awareness Week. Our panel today will discuss the unique part that education can play when it comes to mental well-being and how employers and educators can support their colleagues, learners and themselves using the power of education. I'd now like to introduce our panel of guests, starting with you, Fran, please.
Hi, my name is Fran Longstaff. I'm Head of Psychology at Fika.
And we've also got Fran's colleague, Nick.
Yeah, hello there. I'm Nick Bennett. I'm co-CEO and co-founder at Fika.
And Kevin.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Kevin Moore. I'm one half of a tiny mental health training company called Big Dog Little Dog.
And last but certainly not least, David.
Hello everyone, I'm David Gallagher, Chief Executive at NCFE.
Great, so I'm aware some of our listeners might not be aware of the great work that Fika and indeed Big Dog Little Dog do. So Nick, could I start with you and just tell us a little bit about Fika, please?
Sure, yeah. So Fika is a mental fitness platform. The business was founded by myself and Gareth Fryer. Both of us have our personal stories behind why we founded Fika. Mine was surrounding the death of my best friend Ben, who took his life back in 2014. And in that summer, I decided to do something about it and go on a journey of trying to understand mental health. I didn't understand it at that point. And the business was formed at beginning of 2018. And we've spent the last 3 years with a fantastic team of passionate people, including Fran, who's here on the call, Dr. Fran, I should say. And we've created a curriculum, so the 7 skills of mental fitness curriculum, and a data science driven platform that has been proven to reduce the decline of mental health or prevent the decline of mental health through skills development. And really our mission that we're on is to try and mainstream mental fitness, and that's understanding that and recognizing that there is a mental education gap in curriculum, and has been. We don't recognize key skills like confidence, motivation, positivity, and those we believe are essential life skills. They're not soft skills, as employers have called them in the past, or culture has called them. They're very essential. And so we have been very grateful for the partnership with NCFE to take Fika to the further education sector. We're now working with over 50 education, workplace and healthcare institutions in the UK, and providing our platform to help to plug the mental education gap and improve performance and outcomes for learners across the UK.
Thanks, Nick. A very succinct description there, and I'm sure we'll delve into the work of Fika a little more as the conversation goes on today. Kevin, could you describe the work that Big Dog Little Dog do for us, please?
Yeah, sure. So as I said, I'm one half of Big Dog Little Dog. I'm the bigger of the two. Bob is the little one. So there's a bit of a height differential going on, hence the name. We are a mental health training social enterprise. Been going for about 3.5 years now. And we deliver a range of training from accredited, like mental health first aid, to more bespoke webinars, remote learning, face-to-face. The relationship with NCFE Cash, we were very proud to work with them last year to develop England's first ever short Ofqual regulated qualification in suicide prevention called STEPS. So we managed to release both a level 2 in suicide awareness and a level 3 in how to have a suicide conversation with someone. My background briefly when it comes to mental health, I sometimes introduce myself by saying I spent far too much of my childhood in an asylum. And that's because my mother was a psychiatric care worker and had to take me as the youngest kid to work every day. So I've lived around severe mental illness all of my life. And I have lived experience as well of both severe depression and panic disorder. So that's what kind of brought me into this field. And now the little one and I spend all of our time mainly in workplaces, trying to destigmatise mental ill health and normalise the conversation.
Great. Thanks a lot, Kevin. So to get the conversation started, I thought we'd start with a bit of kind of context. I'll come to you, Fran, on this. What is the state of mental health generally in the UK? What's been the impact of lockdown? How do you see things at the moment?
Well, I think the short answer is it's probably pretty complicated at the moment. So, when the pandemic first started and we first went into lockdown, there was lots of research coming out within the first 6 weeks to show that, a large proportion of people really felt that they weren't coping with the situation. And that's completely understandable because it was a totally new, unexpected situation where you've never really tested yourself and the skills to know that you could cope with that. So those early figures showed that, over 80% of people were experiencing stress and anxiety. Now, as the lockdowns progressed, the landscape has changed a little. Some research came out by Young Minds not so long ago, where 79% of young people felt that the end of lockdown, they felt that would greatly improve their mental health. Now, that seems quite logical, but actually it's not as straightforward as that, because another survey by Relate has found that 2/5 of people are actually quite nervous about going back into, life as it was, socialising. And there was a great statistic I found that over a third of those people surveyed by Relate were worried about FOMO returning, so fear of missing out. And a lot of us haven't had to have those worries over the past year. So we've got used to our world becoming smaller. So actually there might be a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress about returning to normal. And that kind of matches the research about the situational factors that we know to cause stress. So typically, stress-inducing situations are unpredictable. They're ambiguous. They don't really have a time period to them. All the things that we are going into, we don't know how long lockdown will ease for. We don't know what's going to happen. And then if you also throw into the mix that a third of people who have actually had the virus, a third of those people are likely to develop some type of mental health difficulties on the back of it. It becomes a very complicated landscape, doesn't it? So that's really what we're looking at in terms of the profile of mental health and mental illness at the moment.
So as well as the problems that are exacerbated by lockdown, there are other kind of key milestones and transitional phases in a person's life and certainly on their learning journey as well. What should educators be aware of and how can we support them through those times? Nick, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, sure, Michael. Thank you. I think it's a very interesting question, and it points to the thing that we've been focused on at Fika since founding the business, and it's to do with the concept of prevention. And I know within mental health, we're very used to the idea of interventions and the idea of spotting, crisis and looking at what to do in that crisis. And it, obviously, vital work and, and absolutely brilliant work has been done across the sector. But what we've tried to focus on at Fika, and really part of the relationship between NCFE and Fika is to think, how can we look at those key transition points, as you mentioned, such as arriving at your new education institution as a learner, or the probation period of a staff member at a college. Those are points in our lives where there is uncertainty, as Fran mentioned, and that uncertainty of the new destination and difficulty of making new connections where we perhaps don't, have our friend network around us and the sort of the comfort of our routine is quite difficult for humans. And in some of our early research, we looked at a study which tracked the transition of students into a new education institution. And we found that sadly, key metrics such as self-confidence and self-efficacy, positive emotion and life satisfaction all go into a decline. Now, it's quite low level. You arrive at a new education institution and it's a bit exciting, but it's also quite nerve-wracking. And what can happen is that you can start to decline on those key measures of confidence. And So there's an interesting approach, or the way that we have looked at that is to say, well, what about thinking of day one duty of care? Duty of care doesn't have to just start when we've spotted a concern. Duty of care can start on day one, and actually think about building some of the skills that are important to help maintain positivity and to prevent the low level decline of confidence and positive emotions and the build up of stress. So I think educators have a new duty of care, which is to think about prevention and to think of, what are the key points in the academic calendar where both staff and students are faced with challenges. And we can predict those. There are key points in the academic calendar like returning after Christmas, obviously September enrollment, where we know that there's times of change, particularly for new students coming in. And that's really the time to start thinking about, building that self-efficacy and trying to develop skills. So you kind of build a bit of resilience, if you like, or a bit of skill development that helps to, put those students onto a more confident and positive curve.
Michael, could I just jump in with a point on that as well, please, if I may? I think a really vital thing for us to keep in mind in the months ahead is perspective. My favourite saying throughout everything we've been through in the last year is, we're all in the same storm, but we're each in different boats. And I think there's a danger that we start listing risk factors as if they will affect someone's mental health. Fact is, some people will dread starting a new college, going back to the workplace. Some people will be desperate to do it. So I think Nick's point about, actually, let's look at not so much cause as effect. How does that change someone's self-belief, self-efficacy, etc.? We can get hung up sometimes too much on the risk factor, the cause, rather than the effects on the individual.
So, do we think? And I'll ask this question to the panel as a whole. What's the link between mental fitness, a good mental health, and educational achievement? Fran?
Yeah, I think probably a lot of those markers of mental fitness, so confidence, focus, motivation, etc., they're often markers also of positive mental health. And those things have always been, in the research, we know that they're also key predictors of educational performance. They're performance skills, essentially, aren't they? So that I would say they map almost directly onto each other as not only skills that prevent decline, but these are the skills that an Olympic athlete would be trying to build, so that when they get into the 100-meter final and there's less than 0.1 of a second difference between them and their competitor, they on the day can have the edge. So they're performance skills, so they're definitely linked to educational achievement.
Thank you. And that probably takes us nicely to David, actually, because I think, David, I know working for NCFE that we've got a very, very big focus on mental health, both at the moment and historically. Would you like to say a little bit more about our work on mental health to start with?
Yeah, I'll just I'll build on the point Fran makes there and then come back to that, if that's okay, Michael. So, I mean, the sport analogy works for me really well. One, because my life is lived in analogies. Two, because I really enjoy sport, but actually, hopefully, this makes sense as well. So, and it was something that Nick said to me a while back, actually, that's really stuck with me. And it's about the fact that not many people can walk out the door and just go and run a marathon, without any training, without any preparation. We wouldn't expect to go out onto a sports field without doing the training and the preparation and expect to perform really well. Yet we sort of deal with life without necessarily getting ourselves mentally fit and strong and healthy. And so I think the analogy plays through really well, actually, that for a long time now, we as an organisation, but also more in sort of the public's conscience, if you like, is we know that we need to do exercise to be physically fit. We know that we need to sleep well to be physically fit and healthy. We also know now that obviously, of course, plays through to mental fitness. We know more about diet and how important that is. Yet until recent years, there hasn't been enough emphasis on what it means to be mentally fit and what it means to be mentally healthy. And Nick, again, one of the things that he talked to me about was that we operate a deficit culture. So that there are services and there are support mechanisms available, but it quite often doesn't kick in until crisis. And sometimes that's too little, and it's certainly too late. Well, actually, if we go back right to the beginning, root cause, and think about being fit and strong and healthy, prevention is always better than cure. In every respect. So I think that the sporting analogy, it really makes sense to me, and thinking about mental health as not just about health, but about fitness as well, and how you can constantly be working on that to be able to deal with whatever the world throws at you. And in this volatile, unpredictable world that we live in, that's only going to increase in terms of its volatility and unpredictability, which I know isn't great news for some people. That's what I think we really need to think about. And then to NCFE specifically, why I think this is so important, why I think we at NCFE think this is so important, is because education is, it can be a cause for stress, it can be a cause for pressure, but it can also be it can be the thing that inspires people and motivates people, excites people, sets people up for life, sets people up for career, etc. So I think education as a means for helping people to be as mentally fit and strong as they can be, it is really important, because actually you'll get better educational outcomes, better life outcomes. And NCFE, we're an educational charity first and foremost. So for a long time, literally over 100 years, we've thought a lot about educational outcomes. In recent times, we've thought more about educational experiences. And as we've got deeper into that and we've understood the science, we've listened to partners, we've understood that actually, just teaching technical skills or some academic skills in English and maths, whilst that stuff's important, it is not the most fundamental, it's not the most profound thing that you can do to improve people's educational experience itself, the outcomes that they get, and the opportunities that they get thereafter. So I talk about meta skills a lot, but mental fitness, meta skills, adaptability, resilience, creativity, problem solving, all of these things are hugely important to us for the educational experience, but also for people's life opportunities, life chances.
Thanks, David. So Nick, how would we encourage people, how can we actually help people to support their own mental fitness?
Well, it's an interesting question, and maybe riffing a little bit on what David just mentioned, when we talk about mental fitness as an analogy to physical fitness, it's not going to be. This is another analogy coming in. Sorry, it's not going to be a walk in the park. By its nature, a marathon is quite a challenge, and in the same way, any physical fitness is also quite challenging. There was never a person that said, "I can't wait to do my first 12 burpees." But yet with a trainer and with some guidance, you recognise that some training, while it is challenging, it is really rewarding, and I think that's just a little context around setting expectations around mental fitness. It doesn't just arrive. You have to put some work into it, and the way that we've been working with the further education colleges in the UK as part of our partnership with NCFE is to start with the teaching staff and to say, well, this should be led. It's a led experience. You need to lead by example, and so with our partners, we start with the teaching staff, and they do their first courses in mental fitness using the Fika app and the platform. And it's broken down. The Fika platform and courses are broken down into 5-minute exercises, which were the brainchild of Dr. Fran and Dr. Zoe, who are the academic team and the real sort of brains behind the Fika curriculum and the platform. And the purpose of that really was to try and find a way to sort of chunk the education, chunk the health literacy into small bite-sized pieces, but also keeping that fitness analogy. It's not like reading a book on psychology. We don't want you to start on page 1 and just like pour through it in one day. We want you to take small bits of literacy and practice techniques. And so really the way that the Fika curriculum has been created it's a construct of small 5-minute exercises based around learn literacy, reflect on how that affects your life and the challenges that you have, and then an action. And so the process of becoming mentally fit or improving your fitness is a process of using the Fika platform in this instance, following the guidance of the videos and the suggestions within the app, and really leading by example through the education system, where the teaching staff first do their courses, gain their first certificates, and then start to roll that down into the learners' environment and population, and really start to think about earning the certificate. So each of the courses in Fika have a certificate which is endorsed by NCFE at the end of the courses. So we have to keep the analogy, this might get a bit thin, but the sort of medals at the end of the race, everybody who competes gets a medal, so to speak. So these certificates give an endpoint for the learning and the literacy, but they also mean that those certificates can be placed into curriculum. And I think just to take that in full circle to one of the previous questions, how can mental health and education, I think it's really important that we consider that there is a mental education gap. And that's really important to note, that we don't teach these skills as importantly as we do with maths and English. And David alluded to that. And we've conducted some research with NCFE in Britain to try and understand how the pandemic has affected mental health and what the nation thinks about mental education. And in the research, we found that 80% of British people decided that confidence as a hold-all for mental education was important enough to be taught as much and as frequently as maths and English. So I think with that in mind, you kind of then think, well, the way to get mentally fit is to bring the education and literacy of mental education and fitness into a curriculum and teach it on a regular basis, and encourage the habits and the techniques in the same way that we have done with physical fitness and physical culture over the last 30 years.
Fantastic. There's so much to unpack there, Nick. It occurs to me that a lot of the work that we're doing, that kind of duty of care on educators and also colleges being responsible employers for their staff, and keeping their staff to be mentally fit is a very big kind of concern as well. So Kevin, big dog, little dog, do you work with employers on these issues as well?
Yeah, very much so. The vast majority of the work we do is with the workforce. And I think, listening to everything that David and Nick have just said, I think 3 points that come to mind there, whether looking at formal educational settings or the workplace. First of all, when you think of the fluidity of our mental health, and these days we tend to use a model called the mental health continuum, which uses a biaxial way of looking at it. But if we take the old school approach and say, here's a line, we're all on it somewhere. At one end there's crisis, at the other end there's mental strength and resilience. What we need to use education for is to push people along that line. Wherever they are right now, how do we push them on? And how do we encourage them to stay engaged with education to ultimately aspire to get everybody at that end? I think that's point number one. Point number two, I'm mindful of that old saying that in this country, no one has a therapist. And we think it's a bit odd if you do have. Go to America, everyone's got a therapist. They think you're odd if you haven't got. And as much as we might laugh sometimes at the wacky approach we might see over there, I think we miss the point, which is this is support to move you along that line. Accessing support for your mental health doesn't necessarily mean by definition you're in trouble. It means you want your mental health to be better. And I think the final point to make on that, and this really kicks in with the adult workforce, is if listeners think for a moment, where have I learned everything I know about mental health, particularly around mental illness? What's my source? Because balanced, objective, good quality education outside of the mental health sector has only really been around since 2007. And most people understand mental health disorders from what they read in a paper, what they see in a film and on the telly, which makes the role of education incredibly important. If I was to say to you, it can take 6 years to get a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. Now, bipolar is a mood disorder, abnormal lows, abnormal highs. If I don't understand bipolar and I experience it, when I have an abnormal low, I may well go to the GP and say I'm feeling really down and get diagnosed with depression, treatment, medication. But if I don't understand bipolar and I go into a mood that's high, energetic, positive, non-stop, don't need sleep, I feel great. Why the hell would I go to a doctor? So services never get to make an accurate diagnosis. So I think there's a big call for us to use education to up the mental health literacy of the nation as a whole. And the workplace is just as important as further education.
Thanks, Kevin. So, David, I'll put you on the spot a little bit because obviously you're chief executive of a relatively large charity as well. Have you felt, additional pressure due to the pandemic to support your employees and as an employee yourself?
Yeah, I don't mind being put on the spot with that question at all, Michael. So what I would say is, over the last year, I think it's been a roller coaster for everybody. And to Kevin's point around, we might not all be in the same boat, but we're definitely in the same storm. And so, if I speak from a very personal perspective initially, and then I'll move on to in my role and then for NCFE. There's been different points, particularly in this last year, but I suppose when I reflect on it in life more generally, where I've maybe struggled to regulate my emotions. I've been angry or upset about things and not really known why in particular. And it's felt more magnified and more intense in this last year, and at different points in time, and particularly, speaking to experts and speaking to colleagues and speaking to friends and speaking to family. I've forced myself to some extent to step off and think about it, and it's been my mental health. My mental health has absolutely suffered, and one of the things that I don't think would be unique to me by any stretch of the imagination, but is that a constant feeling of guilt. A constant feeling of, in this situation, of letting somebody down somewhere. I'm letting my kids down through homeschooling because I'm busy at work. I'm letting my colleagues down because I'm busy at home. I'm letting my parents down because I can't physically go and see them because they're in the vulnerable category, and just almost at times overwhelming feelings of guilt and feeling like I was letting somebody down. And the thing that I think made it even more difficult for me is I'm quite an extroverted person. I get my energy from being in and around people. I also get my balance and my moderation from being around people as well, physically being around people. I tend to find equilibrium more easily, balance more easily. And sitting in my bloody dining room as I am now for a year or longer, I've just not had that. And the reason I mention that is not to sort of make anyone feel sorry for me, because I wouldn't want anybody to. But it does make me think, for somebody in my situation, in my position in an organisation, who has a relative position of privilege, and I think that's okay to say that. I do have a relative position of privilege in lots of senses. For me to be finding it hard, bloody hell, what about the people that haven't got that? And that was the thing for me that made me really, really realise truly and deeply just how important this is. That for somebody like me in my situation of relative comfort and relative privilege, to be stepping off and thinking, bloody hell, I'm struggling at times here. How hard must it be for other people who just don't have that? And it frightens me actually to think just how tough people have got it, but it also compels me and us to do something about it. And then, if I then put my chief exec hat on, because I know that's a bit of a personal view, it has then put more pressure on me and us to think, what about the people in our organisation? What about the customers and the communities that we serve? And what about the learners that we serve? So it has put a bit more pressure on. But the thing that is, I suppose, really exciting is the wrong word, but it makes me compelled to do more is, well, actually, we've got the position to do something about this. You know, collectively, every individual, hopefully, but also as organisations that are in this space, we can do something about it. So we have, I suppose, worked really hard to listen to where people are at, what people's, you know, very unique challenges are, what's the same across, you know, different populations and different groups, what can we do about it, you know, what are the things that we could and should be working on. So it does bring pressure, but it also, I wouldn't ever shy away from that pressure, because of, I do think that as a leader in the sector, as an educational charity, we've got an opportunity to do something about it, and that's the important thing, you know, taking action and running towards the challenges, not away from it. And the thing that I suppose I'm again, it's probably the wrong word, but one of the things that I'm really delighted about over the last year, it's completely the wrong word, I know, is that it does feel that because people have had the experiences that they've had, that there is more of an openness and a willingness and a desire to talk about these sorts of issues and talk about them very positively and optimistically about what can be done. I just saw a note on LinkedIn this morning where there's a guy said, you know, if I break my leg, everyone's rushing to sign my pot. If I've got a mental health problem, everybody's avoiding me. And it just made me think, do you know what? They're in that one tiny little example, that is part of the problem. So we've still got a hell of a long way to go. But the very fact that somebody feels comfortable and confident posting that on LinkedIn to spark a conversation tells me actually this is the paradigm shift now. You know, where we can all recognise, you know, wherever we are on this spectrum that Kevin talks about, there's something that we as individuals and we collectively could and should do about it. So I feel incredibly blessed to be in the position that I'm in, to be able to hopefully play a tiny little role in a positive change around this particular topic.
Thanks, David. Thanks for speaking so candidly. I'm sure many of our listeners, like myself, will recognise and relate to a lot of the stuff that you've said there. Certainly from my point of view, the kind of feelings of guilt really rang true, actually. Can maybe pick that one up offline sometime, David. So we've talked a lot today about, you know, how we can stay as mentally healthy as possible, you know, using Kevin's kind of paradigm, pushing him to one side of that scale. But what about people who reach crisis? You know, what's actually happening here, and how can that manifest itself? How can we spot the signs?
First of all, just building what David's just said about running away from the conversation. We know that work takes up more of our waking time, thoughts and emotions than any other aspect of our life if we're in full-time employment. We know that good work is fantastic for our mental health. In fact, there's a government strapline of employment as a health outcome. But we know that bad work can be absolutely detrimental. Unemployment could even be life-ending. Yeah, if I then say about a time to change survey that was done back in 2017, surveying workers in this country about how comfortable they are talking about various subjects. The bottom line of that was only 13%, 13% said they'd be comfortable talking about their mental health at work. And when you look at the rest of the data, another way of presenting that fact is that people are more willing to talk about their money worries and their sex life than their mental health. Not their mental ill health, their mental health. And we need to normalise the conversation, not just about that person struggling, but actually that person's doing well, how can we help them get really well? To come on to your actual question, Michael. We need to be alert of the signs of crisis. But again, perspective, different people present in different ways. What we must never do is have this handy checklist that we think describes what a disorder looks like, because mental ill health is far more personal than that. We need to be conscious of the risk factors, of the typical activators for crisis, and we need to be proactive in having conversations. There's some good training out there. There's the mental health first aid qualifications, the one brought over from Australia. Cash have their own mental health first aid qualifications, so there's some good mental health literacy training, which does have some focus on proactivity, but is mainly about crisis. And then, of course, we've got the more extreme end where there are suicide prevention qualifications, self-harm intervention qualifications. However, you can upskill me till the cows come home. Unless the person sat opposite me is willing to open up, what's the point? So a big emphasis in all of this skills training that so many of us are now delivering around the country is how do we present ourselves to that person in that non-judgmental way to reassure them that they can be completely open and honest with us. When I look at the suicide prevention qualification we developed with Cash, the driver behind us designing that model was there's a myth that says if you ask someone who's struggling if they've thought about suicide, you might put the idea in their head. Load of rubbish. The fact is that if you are someone who's struggling and they have considered suicide, you're giving them permission, not only permission to talk, but to release thoughts and feelings that might have been bottled up for days, weeks, months, years. Asking saves lives. So the big challenge for us in promoting the STEPS qualifications is really getting the workplace and the learning sector to understand that it's a life-changing qualification. We can actually get people upskilled to sit down with someone who is struggling and encourage that person to fully open up. And what I said earlier about where have the general public learnt about mental health from, even more so on the subject of suicide, where most people have learnt about the subject through fiction. There's a lot of myth busting we need to do. Because if I'm bottling up those thoughts and I've got an idea that you're going to judge me if I release them, guess what? I'm saying nothing. So crucial role for us to play in workplaces, in education, about enabling those discussions. What's going on in your life? How's it affecting you? What can you and I do about it? And that's STEPS in a nutshell.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up shortly, so I'm going to ask each of our guests, I'll start with you, David, just to give you a little bit more thinking time here, just for one final point, and that can be, a personal reflection, something that a recommendation for listeners to take action on, whatever that might be, but, just one final reflection from each of our guests, please. So, David, please.
Okay, so the thing that springs to mind for me, it's around connection, which is one of the 7 aspects of Fika. One of the things that I tend to do when I'm stressed, when I'm anxious, when I'm worried, is I withdraw. I go into my shell, and it's the worst. It's the worst thing for me. I know it, but I'm still not great at necessarily immediately recognizing it. And even when I do, I'm even worse at doing something about it. So one of the things that I find most useful is forcing myself to proactively connect before it becomes an issue. So one example of something, and it was genuinely triggered by the Fika platform. It asked me, and it was a while ago now, to could you reach out to 2 people a day and just have a good conversation? You'd ask them how they are and how they're doing, and through that, and I did. I picked up the phone to 2 people, had a brilliant, short but brilliant conversation. And after those 2 short conversations where I just asked 2 people how they were, I felt so much better. And it was that through asking them a question and getting into a conversation, my day improved dramatically. 2 tiny little phone calls, and that's all it took. And it was at a point where I actually could have gone away that day, fed up, frustrated, probably had a couple of beers on a school night, woke up groggy the next day, the worst possible start, and I didn't. 2 small phone calls, and it made a difference. And I know that some people in some situations will not feel that they are able to be the one that reaches out. So we've all got to reach out to each other all of the time. But honestly, the difference that made to my mental health in that day, and probably for the rest of that week, was pretty profound. And it was 2 little phone calls. So sometimes those tiny little things can make the biggest difference. So figure out, what are the things that are going to help you the most, and just try and do them as often as you can, even when you don't feel you're able.
Thanks, David. Some really practical advice there. Nick, can I come to you next, please?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Michael. I think I would like to just end with a comment around language, really, and I think it's to do with thinking of this very simple balance in our British culture. We have for a long time thought of physical fitness as a positive area of that health spectrum. And just think of those words now. Think of the words physical fitness. What does it mean? It means something that you get involved with yourself, each individual. You have autonomy over that. And you learn some things and you practice them, and then you start to look after your own fitness. And that's something we've been doing for 20, 30 years, and everyone is aware of it. And it's a very positive area, particularly for young people to aspire towards. And I just want to ask the listeners to just consider, why don't we have the same with mental fitness? Why is it possibly the first time you've heard the words mental fitness? Why have we not exposed that positive area in language on that health spectrum? Because the tragedy of not doing that for so long has meant that positive language hasn't existed in mental health, not really, not like we have in physical fitness. And that lack of positive language is a bind, and it inhibits good cultural growth. It inhibits demand, and that in turn inhibits investment. And I think one of the key things that we have been short on in technology and in the venture capital and funding space is investment into positive prevention and mental fitness, because the language and the demand hasn't been there, and therefore not enough investment from the government, not enough investment from private equity money, and relying on great businesses like NCFE to step up and try and support these areas and help to increase that language and make a really important change in culture. So think about balancing mental fitness to the same point as we do and have held physical fitness.
Thanks, Nick. Very succinctly put. Fran, can I come to you next, please?
Yeah, sure. Probably I'm thinking really embracing open-mindedness and curiosity. These are two things that sometimes can, we get fixed in our ways of thinking about things, ways of doing things, the things that we read, the things that we learn. But actually, a big predictor of our mental fitness is to be open-minded to different sources of information, be curious. So I would really be encouraging people to, think about something that maybe you don't know anything about suicide. Read a little bit about it, read a little bit about mental fitness, kind of open up those learning pathways. And that's really important, I think.
Thanks, Fran. And I'll give the last word to Kevin.
Thank you. Yeah, I think 2 points that I'd like to make to close from my end. The first of all, and I hope we've made it enough throughout this podcast, is mental health conversations aren't just about having a conversation with someone who's in crisis. We need to normalise conversations about our mental health across that whole spectrum. That's the short point. The longer point comes back to what David was saying earlier about the marathon. We all acknowledge these days we've all got mental health. If you've got a pulse, you've got mental health. But that also means we've all got mental health needs. And the Department of Health have done a really good definition of mental health needs. I'd encourage listeners to Google it. In essence, that says every aspect of our life influences, either meets or doesn't meet our mental health needs. And where David said about the marathon, I always say it's slightly different, which is if you compare it to physical health, you'll never meet someone who's really physically fit by accident. People only get really fit by working on their fitness. And that's the approach we need to take around our mental fitness as well.
Thanks very much, Kevin. And indeed, thanks to all of our guests, and thanks for listening to the podcast.
Thank you for listening to the NCFE podcast. You can find out more about NCFE, our guests and supporting information and links relating to this topic at ncfe.org.uk/podcast.